Hey there, thanks for tuning in to Dirt Bike Channel. I'm your host Kyle Brotherson, and today I'm going to do a review of the Racetech suspension that we had installed on this bike and this bike. Stick around. Just something to keep in mind, guys. Suspension is such a subjective thing. It's different for everyone. One person likes one thing, another person likes another thing. And so when you get your suspension revalved, it's important to find a tuner that is committed to helping you be satisfied after the fact, because what I like is not necessarily what you're gonna like, and what another guy likes is not necessarily what I'm going to like. So it's important to get a tuner, a suspension tuner, that is going to be committed to making sure that you're happy with the end results, because it will take some fine tuning after all is said and done. So first I'm gonna talk about the 300 XC-W TPI, and then we'll move into the job that happened on the 2003 Honda CR250R project bike. The KTM came pretty good from the stock. They have an open cartridge 48 millimeter fork, and these things are pretty good, but they have a little bit of a stink bug effect, and sometimes that can kind of mess me up as I go into corners. So one of the things that we did with this bike, with the Racetech suspension, is it's a lot better balanced. The guys over at MotoXperts, Kevin Egbert, thank you for doing this bike. This thing became a lot more balanced, and I feel so much more comfortable pushing harder on this thing. And that's kind of the best thing that this suspension did for me, is this bike now is the best handling KTM 300 XC-W that I have ever been on. And I feel so at home with this. This feels a lot more like my XC suspension. It's one of the reasons why I like the XC lineup with KTM, and this bike feels a lot more like that. Even though I had them bias this more towards a mountain single track type bike, and I've been able to get into a little bit of single track on this thing, actually a fair amount. A lot of the stuff though that we've done so far has been in the desert, because it's been winter and springtime here in Utah. But this bike has become so much better balanced, and it is now my favorite XC-W that I've ever had. I've mentioned that before. I can push hard into corners, and I feel like it's just going to hold up and it's going to work. So what are some of the things that happen? First and foremost, it kind of the Racetech revalve suspension job that MotoXperts did took this bike and it took the stink bug effect away. So the rear end doesn't sit up so high. It's more balanced. They ended up setting the forks further down in the triple clams, which I think kind of balances this bike out and makes it a little bit more stable. It makes it a little bit longer. So overall it has a little bit more stability at speed. One of my favorite things though is that this bike, now with the forks, it really has a good absorption effect in that small chatter and the small rocks. It's really easy for the fork to move in that initial part of the stroke, and so it soaks up that stuff really well. It's extremely organic in the way that it soaks things up. It's better than stock in the small choppy stuff. So that has been a really nice thing. I already mentioned that the initial stroke became a little bit more plush, but also the transition from the initial part of that stroke up into the mid-range is more progressive. And so it just gives me a better feel up in the handlebars, and I have really enjoyed that. I don't have any surprises, and this thing really doesn't deflect or do anything bad now with the front end. It just inspires a ton of confidence in me. It also happens to have better bottoming resistance, and I don't know how they did it. Kevin talked about different shims and different progressive stacks and all these different things. All I know is that this fork can now be pushed really hard into whoops and G-outs, and I don't feel like I'm slamming on the bottom of it. Not that I slam on the bottom a lot, but it just feels like it's more progressive, so that it just isn't as harsh up in my hands. Moving on to the Honda, the best money that we spent on the Honda so far was on the suspension. This Racetech revalve that we did has been amazing. Before we did anything to that, the Honda was just kind of terrible for me. It still had that motocross valving, and it was just really stiff, and I just felt like I was hammering through everything. And it also felt like there was a I don't know, I keep changing the number, but it felt like there was a really heavy weight on the front wheel, just kind of forcing it down. And it was so biased towards the front wheel that it felt like you could never get the front wheel up, and it was just slamming through everything and plowing through everything. Now all of a sudden the bike was better at absorbing the rocks. Before I was just pounding through the rocks. Now it was soaking a lot of that stuff up, and also made it so that the front wheel didn't feel like it was quite so pinned down to the ground. So it made the front end feel a little bit lighter. And the geometry of this bike is much different than, say, like one of these bikes, like the KTM. So we did the sag a little bit different. On the KTM, we were doing the sag at like, I think 108 millimeters. On this one, we did the sag at 105 millimeters with the different setup, and there's some, and maybe I might even try a little bit more sag on this to see if I can feel like the front end if I can get that front end a little bit lighter. But overall, it made the bike a lot easier to ride in off-road conditions. The biggest thing for me was just getting some of that harsh feedback through the handlebars. It took some of the harsh feedback out, because now just the suspension was able to actually work. Before, it was valved so much for just smashing through, or going off big jumps and smashing through, that it just wasn't absorbing anything, and it kind of made the bike terrible to ride in the off-road conditions that I'm riding it in. So the Racetech Revalve really started to help the whole suspension work underneath me, to where it started to absorb some of the things and some of the trails that we were going on. Changed the character of this bike night and day. So that's been my experience on these as we revalved both of these bikes. Now I will say that I'm kind of spoiled, because I'm right in the weight range that these bikes are pretty much set up for. So if you're between 150 to 180 pounds, you're kind of right in the sweet spot for all these bikes. And so if you are in that sweet spot, I feel like you don't get as much of a benefit as a rider does if they're, say, like 210 or 200 or something like that, or even 130 pounds. If you're outside of the weight range for these bikes, getting your suspension revalved is going to help you even more than if you're kind of like me, where you're kind of right in, the Goldilocks zone of where these bikes are set up for from the factory. If you're local to the Intermountain area and you're thinking about getting your suspension revalved, I would highly recommend that you go to MotoXperts. They don't pay me to say that. I just had a really good experience with them. They did both of these bikes and they did a fantastic job. They have great customer service, and they're right here and they're local. Then you wouldn't have to ship your suspension off to Timbuktu in some box somewhere. They did a really good job for me, and they're committed to making sure that you're happy with the suspension after you get it. And that's a big part of this, is having that suspension tuner help you tune the bike afterwards, after the fact, because everyone wants something a little bit different. That's the thing to know about this, is everyone wants something a little bit different, and it helps to have somebody to help customize that feel that you want. Thanks for watching these videos, guys. If you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon. There's some benefits over there. You can also use the links down in the description down here for parts and tires and Amazon and Rocky Mountain ATV and Motorsport. All of those things really, really help me to support my family. So thank you for using those links. Doesn't cost you anything. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will see you in the next one.